Good afternoon, Professor Smart. We're going to continue with some more questions. And you had said, can I please direct you to Mr. Hutchings' words? And so let's take a look at compendium slide 34 at tab 10. Sorry, page 31. Tab 10. And we're sticking with the theme of differences in methodology. Now, he uses a methodology that to include all of the costs, one must include all of the benefits. That's one of his methodological points. Do you agree with that? That's one of his?
And before I answer that, Mr. Schachter, I would like to correct an answer I gave to one of your questions this morning. I can do it now immediately or later, but I want to go on the record immediately that at some point I would like to correct a statement I made.
You can correct it right now. I don't know what it is, but go ahead.
Right. So you were asking me this morning about my work papers, and you displayed an image, a screen image of something that you saw in your version of my work papers. You asked about whether the number was different than the number that I testified to. In particular, you showed a present value of NCRs equal to minus 4.8 billion. You asked why that was different than the minus 4.6 billion, as I call it, minus 4.5 as you call it, that was in my testimony. And I said that as far as I knew, my work papers were fully reflective of all the changes. Having looked into it further, I now realize that the work papers that were submitted by me through Ontario to you, dated the 14th, did not reflect in the version that you saw that final change to the RST trackage. So my work papers are fully reflective of it, but the version that I sent on to you through Ontario did not reflect that final one change. Again, it was very unfortunate that I made a change so late in the process, and I apologize to everyone. I know it does create confusion. In this case, the difference between what I see and what I sent on through Ontario to you, it reflects the redaction process, which creates some complications. In all of our calculations, we have to calculate Ontario, RHT and RST at the same time. Then we were asked to redact every reference to RHT. That creates a difference between what I was asked to present to the court and what I see on my own computer. I failed, and this is entirely, everything we're talking about is my error, and no one else's. I failed to check that the redacted version that was passed on was fully reflective of that final change. I believe that it does reflect every other change other than the decision I made at the last minute, the last weekend, to reduce my expenses for railway aid, and only that. The number that you displayed, minus 4.8, which I agree was in the work papers that were sent to you, it was correct until I reduced the railway expenses. It's no longer correct. Now it becomes minus 4.5 billion, as you call it, 4.6 as I call it. And so the number that you are looking at isn't fully reflective, and my work papers, as you saw them, did not reflect that final change to RST trackage. Again, my error. I will point out that it is possible to replicate all of my final numbers by using the input files that you did receive, which were fully reflective of all changes, plus using the computer instruction files that were provided earlier. So it would be possible to produce the minus 4. It would be possible to produce, using all of the things I provided, my final number. But as a convenience, I also included my version of the final number. Unfortunately, I did not check if the redaction copy updated at that final step. That was the error, and that explains the difference. I apologize. I know it did create confusion. I felt that I had to make that change because it was of benefit to the plaintiffs, as I see it, and because it's more accurate. I'm sorry it came so late and that it created confusion.
Thank you. Anything else you want to add about that?
No.
So back to my question about the themes I had put slide 30, sorry, compendium page 31, Hutchins slide demonstrative 105. To the first bullet point, I said that Mr. Hutchins has a methodology where to include all of the costs, one must include all of the benefits. And I asked you, do you understand that to be one of his methodological points?
It's a point that he makes. It's right here on his slide as you've reproduced it. It doesn't describe his methodology. He does not include all of the benefits.
Well, he doesn't include all of the costs either.
Right. So it does correctly describe his explanation for why he proceeded as he did.
All right.
But the statement, one must include all the benefits, does not describe his methodology.
Do you agree with the statement that to include all of the costs, one must include all of the benefits? Do you agree that that's accurate?
It does not describe our methodology. No, I don't agree with that statement.
Okay, thank you. I want to go to the third bullet because the second bullet is an explanatory note, I would think. But the third bullet on page 31 says, to be economically meaningful, the expenses included must be related to the collection, regulating, and support of the included relevant revenues. You see that? That's what he said.
Yes.
And do you understand that to be his method, part of his methodology?
Yes, I think the phrase after the comma is a paraphrase of the Court of Appeal decision, just as we paraphrased it and as we tried to apply it. We both tried to apply those ideas.
Mr. Hutchins has a general principle which you'll find over on page 32 of the compendium as part of his methodology, a general principle. Would someone reasonably expect the incremental increase in included relevant revenues to be greater than the expected portion of the expense attributable to the relevant revenues? You understand that to be part of his methodology?
Yes, I do.
And you disagree with that?
I don't agree that it's the correct methodology. I do agree it was the principle he applied.
Thank you. And would you agree with me that another incident or one of the fallout features or one of the features of his methodology is that expenses incurred after the fact, such as reforestation, should not be deducted from past revenues because they don't support the relevant revenue stream being considered? You understand that's part of his methodology?
I'm not sure that I do, but I will point out that it's not what he's referring to here when he establishes his general principle. I interpreted the general principle on demonstrative slide 106 to mean I will only include the expense if a reasonable person would expect that amount of expense to generate at least as much revenue as that. So at least 100% recovery of that expense in revenues. He doesn't say whether it has to be in the same year or not. So I think here he's making a different point. He's proposing the principle that expenses should only be included if 100% or more of those dollars come back to the Crown as revenues.
Yeah, I wasn't referring to this, to page 32 when I asked the question.
I'm sorry, then you asked about the timing of expenses.
Yes. So my question was unrelated to page 32, and I apologize for not taking it down. Mr. Hutchings has a methodological approach that expenses that were incurred temporally in time after the fact do not support relevant revenues that are taken into account, like reforestation. Do you understand that to be part of his methodology?
I don't recall a place in which he advanced that principle as you've just described it. I do agree he did not include reforestation expense. And I would be happy to review any statements he made around the timing, either of reforestation or of other things. But I agree, he did not include reforestation. We did include reforestation. And one reason it's easier for me to speak to what we did. One reason we included it is that we recognize that that expense might be referable to revenues that were collected in previous years. That's a point that we made. And I do think that that's right.
Well, you think your opinion is right? You mean?
I do think my opinion is right. Well, what I'm trying to say here is that it's easier for me to speak to my opinion without reference to the documents.
Let's try and speak to your opinion about a but-for test. Now, you testified to that in direct a bit.
Yeah.
And I want you to explain to me, if you don't mind, what but-for do you ask? I want to be clear about this because it's important to see if there's a difference in methodology.
In the context of reforestation, for example?
No, in the context of any expense. Do you have a general rule on a but-for rule that you can articulate for the court?
Well, I am right now thinking about the reforestation example, but I'll try to generalize from it, speak in general terms, check whether it makes sense to any of us. But for the activities that generated the revenue, there would be no expense. That's what we apply in the case of reforestation, I think.
And do you, are you aware that Mr. Hutchings expresses a but-for analysis quite differently?
At the moment, I cannot recall specific statements that he framed in that way, but I'd be happy to review them.
Well, I'm going to paraphrase it and see if it jogs your memory. My understanding is that in his methodology, if the expense in question would have been incurred anyways for other reasons, he wouldn't take it into account. That's different than your but-for test. Would you agree?
It sounds different than what I just said, yes.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if we could turn to your slide 11. On your demonstrative. And here we're going into a new area of discussion. At slide 11, you say in the first bullet that you corrected 2 minor transcription errors pointed out by Mr. Hutchings. And the second, I wanted to discuss briefly the second one about fish and wood, which is the second bullet where it says 1 led fish and wildlife expenses to be improperly included in a few years. And at the bottom of the page, the last bullet says, as shown on previous slide, effective changes to increase values. But prior to that, two bullet points up, you say, as I will explain, affects magnitude of NCRR losses, but no impact on value of augmented annuities under our approach. You see that there?
Yes,
And the reason why it has no impact is because of the way you calculate the annuities using a risk-adjusted approach, and in terms of the approach you attribute to a couple of authors from 1849. Fair?
well, that was a fairly long question. You referred to 3 different bullets and sub-bullets on this slide. And then you referred to other things not on this slide related to our methods. I'm going to try to answer all of it, but if I fail to do so, please do follow up.
I will.
The
Thank
first
you.
change relates to fish and wildlife, as you correctly said. It does not relate to wood, as you incorrectly said. We did include some such expenses. Mr. Hutchings pointed it out. We've corrected it. It mainly has an impact on the present value of NCRs and not on the value of augmented annuities as we estimate those, because again, that change is, I believe, only in the years for which we estimate the Crown had accumulated NCR losses. And in our model, there's no remaining augmentation. The augmentation happened in respect of earlier years. So I think that change had a significant impact, a substantial impact even on NCRs and on nothing else. The next thing you refer to on the slide is the final bullet, which says the effect of the changes is to increase values. That is true of the fish and wildlife change. It increased NCRs, although I do not think it changed the value of annuities. And it's true of every other of the changes described here. The third bullet you referred to explains this general point that would apply to both the specific examples we've just discussed. These changes that Mr. Hutchings asked for, and that in these cases, we've made the change that he asked for, they do affect NCRs, but the losses in NCRs in recent years, we tried to make it clear that in our model, those changes do not affect the value of the augmentation promise as we've calculated it. It may be we were not clear enough about that. Now, I will say, we wanted to do everything right. We wanted, of course, with this massive data task and the many thousands of numbers in our calculation, it was my desire that each one of those calculations and estimates was as accurate as possible. In these cases, I acknowledge that I made specific calculation errors or transcription errors. They affected only the portion of our accounts that does not pass through to augmented annuities. And that's the point that I've made in the final bullet on this slide. The remaining part of your question, I think, related to just that point. We do attribute that approach to the Vidal and Anderson proposal, as I described on Friday, and the specific fact that there is no augmentation under that approach after some data in the early 1970s, according to our calculations. And the only way that would change, I'm speaking a little bit roughly here in terms of mathematics. The only way that would change is if we made sufficient changes to these post-1960 accounts so that our cumulative NCR losses at the end, which currently stand at minus 4.6 billion, became a positive number, or at least that it remained positive for more years, significantly more years after 1960. And so as much as I've tried to do everything carefully at every step, I've also been aware of the sensitivity and insensitivity of our calculations to specific assumptions. And I concluded that whatever changes one were to make, whether the ones that are favored under Mr. Hutchings' opinion or under our own, they wouldn't change that central fact that the Crown has accumulated NCR losses. They would have very minimal impacts, therefore, on augmented annuities. That was also a long answer to your long question, but I hope it was helpful.
Well, I think in the future, I'm going to do my best to try and keep my questions a little bit shorter to help you out.
Can I see if I get the bottom line of this? Whatever changes you were making, they were post 1960. Because of the accumulated losses, there would be no change to the annuities.
Virtually no change, Your Honor.
Okay, so I don't want you to go too far in that. So whether all the expenses, whether the differences of opinion you have with respect to expenses with Mr. Hutchings, or if, and I don't have them on the top of my head, if there were differences of opinion on revenues, none of that would make a bit of difference because of the accumulated losses.
To make my answer as clear as possible, I'll say, let's imagine these changes occurred after 1990.
Yes.
Then, yes, absolutely. Any changes to accounts only after 1990 and not before would affect NCRs, but not annuities under our approach.
And this may be the first time I heard 1990s. Would you say the same for 1980s?
I think that I would.
Because I thought I had heard you say that it was the 60s and the 70s. It was the
Yes.
60s and 70s by the point the accumulated losses had reached such a number.
I'm trying to be cautious, but Your Honor understands my logic exactly. And if I were less cautious and more communicative, I would say the 1980s are exactly the same. 80s, 90s, into, of course, the 2000s, changes to NCR losses that had no impact before would have no impact on the value of augmented annuities. Because on our approach, the Crown would say augmentation is
Just
over,
wait, sorry, losses or gains?
losses or gains.
Okay, so whatever changes to NCR are losses or gains after 1980, let's say, under your approach would have no impact on your opinion of how to calculate the augmented annuities.
Yes.
Okay,
Professor Smart, it would have a significant impact, this fish and wildlife error that you talk about. It would have significant impact if the judge decides to look at net Crown resource revenues, right? As a measure of what the annuities should be.
Yes, I agree with that. We have estimated net Crown resource revenues to be minus $4.6 billion. Evidently, if assumptions about NCRs were to change, then that number would change. I do not regard that number as in any way indicative of the amount by which annuities should have increased. Of course, to say a number should increase by a negative is the same as saying it should not have increased, it should have decreased. I do not believe that that's the case.
It's hard to read your slides without feeling that you're trying to communicate to the judge and to the court that the errors that Mr. Hutchings pointed out that you agreed to, and let's just deal with the fish and wildlife error that we're on right now, are inconsequential. It sounds like that's what you're trying to communicate to the judge. Is that a fair assessment?
We tried to do the best we can with every calculation. We did make errors, as did Mr. Hutchings, but his errors are not at issue here. It's important that I tell you my best guess, but also the sensitivity of my conclusions to possible errors or alternative assumptions. I can tell you that our estimated value of augmented annuities is not sensitive to these issues for the reasons I just explained.
All right, well, if you don't mind me taking you to page 22 of the compendium tab 6. This is an excerpt of Mr. Hutchins' reply report. And at paragraph 72, he tried to point out the error which you eventually agreed to. And at paragraph 72, he explains, Professors Bodway and Smart classify this line item, referring to Fish and Wildlife Management, as included and non-overhead, despite correctly excluding it in other years and never including fish and wildlife revenues. The impact of these 15 affected years is more than $300 million in nominal terms and more than 500 million at their present value factors. So $500 million is a significant amount of money, wouldn't you agree?
Yes,
And if you used Mr. Hutchins' 60-40 present values, it would be even more significant. Would you agree?
I don't agree that's relevant to the question of how our calculations would change because we never use those 60-40 numbers.
Okay. Well, how about if the judge would use it? Do you think that that would turn the 500 million into a larger number?
Yes, it would, but since we haven't performed any of those calculations using the 60-40 rates, a particular choice about that number and the error that we made would not affect any calculations that are in evidence.
Now, when you received Mr. Hutchins' reply report, you looked to see if he was correct or he was wrong, did you?
I tried to. It was difficult to follow the point that he was making. When I read the transcript of his testimony, I understood what he was saying better.
So you couldn't look at footnote 97 of his report and follow along what he was intending to do?
There are more complex issues involved here relating to the way in which we did calculations based on the spreadsheet that are referenced in footnote 97. Footnote 97 itself doesn't tell the answer to what is right and what is wrong.
Your response, sir, to Mr. Hutchins trying to point out an error, if I can call it that, is contained in paragraph 38 of your SIR reply report to Mr. Hutchins, which you will find paragraph 38 at page 25 of of tab 7 of the compendium. I wonder if you could turn there, please.
Well, I want to do as directed, but it's in front of me on the screen. And I'm also at the same time referring to the other relevant document that you pointed me to before. So they're both before me right now.
Okay. So your response to Mr. Hutchins after trying to see if there was any weight to his concerns about your calculations was, Mr. Hutchins states we included fish and wildlife management spending in the 1997 to 2011 period. And then you make a reference to his paragraph 72, which we just referred to. And then you say this, his statement is categorically incorrect. We did not include this item in our accounts. Mr. Hutchins simply failed to understand the computer instruction files that we included in our work papers. See that?
Yes.
Now, the reason why I'm raising this is not to, to debate the amount of the error. It's really just the tone that you're using towards Mr. Hutchins. He wasn't just incorrect. I mean, everyone, you could have an opinion that he's incorrect, but why did you say that he was categorically incorrect? What made you use that word?
I think that in writing that, we were referring to what he wrote on page 41 of his report, which you didn't include in your compendium.
All right, well, we're going to bring up page 41. do you have page 41 of Mr. Hutchings' reply
Okay,
report?
I do now, I believe, I mean, I can't see the page number. I'm sure it's right. My conjecture was incorrect. So there were other statements in the reply report related to this. I don't know where they are. I don't have that report before me. You asked a question about my tone, sir, and I did my best to answer. It doesn't change the fact that we acknowledge that Mr. Hutching was right on this point and we were wrong, but our best understanding based on everything that we read in his reply report was that he was not correct.
I'm sorry, it's the word categorically that I'm trying to understand. What is it that you looked at to make sure it was categorically correct to the best of your knowledge at the time?
I looked at the totality of his reply report, which unfortunately I do not have here now. And I looked at my own computer files and categorically meant, I know I'm right and I was wrong. I was wrong. He was right. And so that statement, where I say he was categorically incorrect, that's wrong. We acknowledge that. We've made that change, which he asked for, in our accounts, and it's fully reflected in every number that I've testified to. You're asking questions about the tone. I'm doing my best to explain that when I wrote that SIR reply, I had certainty based on my understanding of what he wrote, that I was right and he was wrong, and I was incorrect about that.
Could I just get one thing? You say we acknowledge we were wrong. Is that we later acknowledged or now acknowledged?
I have acknowledged here in
Here.
the slide from my own demonstratives that Mr. Schachter started with
Okay.
for this said precisely that.
Thank you.
So let's just sort of summarize, if I could. There was an error that was alleged by Mr. Hutchings, correct?
Yes,
You looked at his report, you looked at your work papers, you were convinced that Mr. Hutchings was categorically incorrect. Is that true?
yes,
And you were convinced, to the best of your professional opinion, after looking at your work papers, that Mr. Hutchings simply failed to understand the computer instruction files.
yes, because those instructions included a line which said exclude all fish. Therefore, I concluded that that's instruction in my own file would have worked to do what I intended, which was to exclude all fish. Later in his testimony, Mr. Hutchings convinced me, no, that line in my code didn't work. So he was right, and we've acknowledged it. Indeed, I even thanked him for this error. I probably should have said, and not only do I thank him, but I apologize for saying he was wrong the first time. That's how I feel about it.
All right. My point, though, is that this process led you to finding an error, right?
Yes,
And I'm going to suggest to you that it's possible that there are still errors in your code that you haven't acknowledged yet, but still exist. Isn't that possible?
it is possible. I believe I've addressed every issue raised by Mr. Hutchings, though, but it's always possible. This is a complex process. I emphasize these are only estimates. They're dependent on assumptions and data and the specific code and procedures that we use to analyze the data. And I have acknowledged certain errors, and I cannot logically rule out the possibility that further errors exist that have not been identified by Mr. Hutchings or myself, because in some cases, the changes reflect errors of my own that I identified myself.
Perhaps we can move then to slide 17 and your conceptual approach. This is slide 17 of your demonstratives. Now, we just finished talking about language like
So are we
Cate-
on 17 of the demonstratives?
Yes,
Thank you,
under conceptual approach.
thank you.
We just talked about language such as categorically wrong, and in this slide, you kind of continue with what I think is similar tone. What you say in the first bullet, last part of the first bullet, this is an extreme view leading to illogical results. And would you agree with me that that tenor is more than just saying you have a difference of opinion with Mr. Hutchings, or you believe Mr. Hutchings to be wrong? The tone is rather decisive, if I can say that. Would you agree?
It is an extreme view. I've tried to describe in the bottom half of the slide why I think it's illogical. Mr. Hutchings is saying, I won't include the expense unless someone would reasonably believe that that expense would give rise to at least as much revenue to the Crown. And the implication of that, which I regard as illogical, is that first, we would exclude expenses if there wasn't 100% cost recovery. That's a policy decision of the Crown, which I don't think the Court of Appeal decision contemplates is a criterion that we apply here. But the illogical part, so I think that's extreme, right? To require 100% recovery of expenses through further revenues is extreme. The illogical part is the unstated but implicit condition that we would, in cases where there wasn't 100% recovery, we would exclude the expense but include the associated revenues. Well, that's a mismatch between the two sides of Mr. Hutchings' accounts that I regard as inconsistent and therefore, in that sense, illogical.
I put it to you, sir, that Mr. Hutchings did not say what you attribute to him. Would you agree with that?
I don't think I do. I've written that that's a quotation from slide 106, and indeed, you included that in your compendium. We reviewed it just a minute ago. I think it's an accurate quotation.
It's a partial quotation. Let's go to page 32 of the compendium. And what Mr. Hutchings is talking about is not that there must be 100% recovered by costs, recovered by the way of revenues, or sorry, Mr. Hutchings is not saying that revenues must exceed costs. That's the message that you have in your slide 17, isn't it?
I think it is exactly what he says on slide 106. I'll refer you in the first instance to the headline of this slide. There has to be a reasonable, I added, that's an interpolation. He wrote, reasonable expectation of a net positive result. Net means revenue minus expense. So he's saying revenue minus expense must be positive, or revenue must be larger than expense before that expense is included.
Let's take a look and read what you didn't include on your slide 17. You didn't include in his statement that negative or zero results, where actual in italicized revenues are less than actual costs, are possible. See that?
I do see it, yes.
So you've left that off of his slide 17, of your slide 17, excuse me.
Well, I'm not entirely sure what it means. If it means, I'm not sure what it means. Evidently, negative results are possible. The previous bullet that you passed over says exactly what I quoted on my slide. You say it's my slide 17, right?
Yes, 17 of 161.
So there's just one word that I've added, but we'll just look at what he wrote on 106. Would someone reasonably expect the incremental increase in included relevant revenues to be greater than the expected portion of the expense attributable to the relevant revenues? It's an exact quotation with the the word would moved around to match my own syntax, my own grammatical construction. And as I've said, although I find it hard to parse that sentence, I believe that the only interpretation of it is the specific expense item is included only if it gives rise to an incremental increase in revenues that is at least that large. That's what it says.
So
Can I
would,
just check
yeah.
one thing? You said the only, I believe the only interpretation of that sentence, and you're looking at bullet 1 on page 32 or slide 32.
Yes.
Thank you.
would you agree with me that if your interpretation of what Mr. Hutchings said is true, then there could be no years in which there was negative amounts for Mr. Hutchings in NCRRs?
I don't think I agree. But that's a hard question to answer, but it's not what's at issue here. What's at issue on this slide is not the totality of the accounts for a particular year. It's whether a particular expense should be included or not. The word incremental is a word commonly used by economists. I won't call it a term of art, but we use that word to indicate to each other that we're talking about, when you add something, what happens next, what changes. And so I interpret this as being about whether one additional expense item should be included or not. And the decision whether to do so or not is linked to whether the causal effect of that would be to increase revenue by that amount or not. Therefore, I don't think that based on this one principle, I could answer a question about the totality of all of his decisions for a particular year, just whether that kind of last decision, whether to include or not.
Professor Smart, I'm trying to track your understanding of what Mr. Hutchings did.
Yeah.
But I read slide 17 as you saying, your take on Mr. Hutchings is that an expense can only be included if it would generate revenues equal to or greater than the expense. That's what the gist of slide 17 says, isn't it?
That's exactly what I believe his principle is. That is the gist of what I wrote on 17 to describe what he wrote on 106.
All right. So you would agree with me then, if expenses must always be less than or equal to revenues, Mr. Hutchings could not have any negative years of revenues.
Well, if you were to apply this principle in all cases, and if gross revenues was never a negative number, which need not be the case, then that would be true. But I don't think that's the best test of whether he applied the principle as I've interpreted it or not. Instead, we should look at specific items and see whether they're consistent with my interpretation of the principle. One example is the decision to exclude the expenses of the assay office, but as far as I recall from his work papers, to include the revenues of the assay office. So that seems to be consistent with the principle as I've interpreted it. We include an expense only if it gives rise to full recovery through revenues, but we may still include the revenues.
I put it to you, sir, that your statement that there's an implicit condition that Mr. Hutchings would, in cases where there wasn't 100% recovery, he would exclude the expense, but we would, that you would exclude the expense, but we include the associated revenues. I think there might be something wrong in the transcript here. I'm going to try and unpack this for a moment. I'm going to read back what the record shows. And the implication of that, which I regard as illogical, is that first, we would exclude expenses if there wasn't 100% cost recovery. I'm going to pause there for a moment. He doesn't say that, but you say he does? Or I'm sorry, are you suggesting that Mr. Hutchings, that's his implication?
Yes, I am, and I refer you to slide 17. I will
Okay.
clarify that in that quotation that you read back, which I believe is accurate, when I say we, I'm referring to Mr. Hutchings, or rather, we as a collective, as this court,
Oh,
choosing to behave in the way, to proceed in the way Mr. Hutchings has recommended.
but the illogical part, line. So I think that's extreme to require 100% recovery of expenses through further revenue is extreme. That didn't quite make sense to me. Maybe, do you care to clarify that? Or is that a correct statement of what you testified to?
Yes, and I think in the context, it may well have been clear to all of us. It's referring to the word extreme on my slide 17. You asked me to explain whether that sentence on my slide correctly characterized my opinion about the Hutchings methodology. What I said was, it is extreme to exclude an expense item if it is not fully recovered in incremental revenue, in my opinion.
Right. And I'm suggesting to you he doesn't do that. And you disagree with me?
I do disagree with you. And based on my interpretation of what he has done, I conclude that's an extreme approach.
You then continue on and say, the illogical part is the unstated but implicit condition that we would, and do you know who we're referring to in we would? Is it the royal we again? Or is it you and Mr. Bodway, Professor Bodway?
It is we as a collective here today, if we were to adopt Mr. Hutchings' recommendations and proceed in that way.
We would exclude the expense, but we would include in the associated revenues. And you say that that's an error on his part.
I believe it is illogical to do that.
Can you take a look, please, at page 97 of 197, I believe, it's in the compendium. Table 8.
Could you provide a tab or page reference?
Yeah, we're gonna try and find it. Which tab number? Page 26 of what tab? Tab 8. Thank you. Tab 8, page 26. I could not find it. If you wouldn't mind, sir, looking at the year 1855.
Yes, Mr. Schechter, I've got it.
You see that Mr. Hutchings has a negative $601 figure for the year.
Yes,
Would you agree with me that if his methodology required expenses to always be less than or equal to revenues, there couldn't be a negative number?
well, his methodology for the years up to and including 1897 is in fact different than we've been discussing. It is to rely on the accounting of RST revenue and expense that's in the Irving papers, except to exclude some additional expenses that were included in that accounting in the Irving papers. So here, he's not making specific decisions in a way that's consistent with the principle we've just been discussing. Instead, he, like we, Bodway and Smart, are relying on the Irving papers, but then he makes some additional exclusions. He didn't build up that -1601 based on the methodological principle that we've just been discussing. He started with the Irving papers number and then made some changes to it.
So when he says at tab 10, compendium tab 10, slide 32, negative or zero results where actual revenues are less than actual costs are possible, you're saying that's meaningless for his methodology?
Well,
I'm not sure what you're saying. Like,
I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure what Mr. Hutchings did with the Irving papers to get the specific -601.
I'm going beyond the Irving papers. Let's use 1953, 1954. It doesn't matter what year we
Okay.
use. His methodology contemplates the possibility of negative or zero results, which could not be the case if your proposition on slide 17 is correct. Would you agree with that?
Well, in 1953, he doesn't have a negative or 54. And so I'm not sure why you referred me to those years. I don't see any minuses in the years that were created using the Irving papers. I will say again that if he applied that principle consistently throughout, and if gross revenues were never negative, then I agree he could not arrive at a negative number. But I don't believe he ever did arrive at a negative number, except for where his accounts come entirely from the Irving papers.
Yeah, I'm going to try this again. The purpose of referring to 1954 was to choose any year because his methodology, sir, employed and allowed for the possibility that it could go negative. Whether it did or did not, we're talking about methodology here. You understand that, I hope.
Do I understand we're talking about methodology? Yes, I do.
All right. And you understand that the methodology that he says he used, which could result in a negative amount in any one year, is different than the methodology you ascribed to him on slide 17. That's the only point I'm trying to make.
I see. Well, I think if that methodology were applied consistently in all cases, that you are right, it would result in a positive number if gross revenues were always positive. But I don't think that that's what the principle on slide 106, which I quoted, said. That's what he said was his methodology. I've described the meaning for me. And again, just refer you to the phrase, include the expense if one could reasonably expect the incremental increase in revenues to be larger, to be greater. That's what he said. That's what we're discussing. Did he do that or not? I believe he did. I've pointed to one specific example, which is the assay office, which he excluded the expense, but included the revenue, I believe, on the basis of this principle. Regardless of when he did or did not follow the principle enunciated, the principle enunciated is quoted on my slide. To me, as an economist, but I believe in any plain reading, says include the expense only if it's reasonable to think that expense gives rise to an incremental increase in revenue that is greater than that amount. That's what I stated, and I stand by it.
Want to say anything else on that topic?
No, thank you.
Let's move to transportation expenses. And here I want to start with compendium tab 11, which is an excerpt of your report from your nominal values report. And remember, the numbers here are not the numbers that the judge will be working with. in any event, because these are old numbers, correct?
Yes.
All right. But I have some questions about how you came up with these categories of mining, forestry, land, hydroelectric, and transport. And I want to start with a question about what the table is. The table is identified as estimated net Crown resource-based revenues by category. So the 5 categories of resource-based revenues are mining, forestry, land, hydroelectric, and transport. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, so let's focus on transport as a resource-based revenue source. Now, when I look through the transport column, I only ever see negatives. I never see a revenue, a net revenue. I'm correct in that there's no net revenue in table C2?
There's no positive net revenue for the RST. Indeed, I think for the RST, we don't include even any gross revenue in any case. In this case, we're capturing the Crown's subsidies to private railway construction and the Crown's own expenses on roadways, on colonization roads or long distance roads, and the extent to which they contributed to resource rents. So NCRs, recall, are revenues minus expense. In this case, for RST, there are no gross revenues at all associated with that, with either the Crown's subsidies to rail, no gross revenues, and the Crown's own spending on roads, no gross revenues associated with those roads. So the NCRs for that category are a negative number. It's a 0 minus a positive expense item. Does that make sense?
Well, it's understandable. I'm not sure it makes sense to me.
I understand that distinction.
All right, so just to be clear so that everybody can understand it, although you've listed it as a revenue category, there is not $1 of revenue in any one year that you take into account under the heading transport.
Right. Well, we're trying to capture the contribution of the Crown's spending on that to resource rents and therefore to revenues from resource rents.
Thank you. But the Crown does in fact recover some revenues from transport, does it not?
Yes, and for example, in our accounts for RHT, would not be revealing anything redacted to say, we did include gross revenues for certain years of the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway because they offset subsidies. So we recorded some upfront subsidies paid by the Crown, and then we recorded the offsetting revenue that came back to the Crown. We didn't see anything in the subsidies given to the private railways because, notice the distinction, Temiskaming and Northern was owned by the province of Ontario. We didn't see anything equivalent in the Crown's railway subsidies in the RST that would necessitate including a gross revenue amount.
Well, you may not agree with what I'm about to put to you, but would you agree that the Crown earns corporate taxes on railroad companies' revenues that was earned on transporting resource-related goods such as trees or minerals?
I believe the question is whether the Crown earned corporate tax revenues from railways.
Yes.
And for some years in our accounts, the answer to that is yes. There was a corporate tax and it was payable by railways, yes.
And you don't include that in your calculation of transport revenues?
No, because we believe corporate income taxes are not taxes on resource rents. They are taxes on the return to capital for the most part.
And you don't include in as a resource revenue under transport any charges for rights of way or easements over Crown land that might have been charged to railways?
I'm quite certain that we don't include any expenses. I don't recall encountering any such payments from the railways for the use of land in the public accounts that we reviewed. So no, we don't have them. I don't recall ever making a decision to exclude them because I don't recall ever seeing information on such revenues.
So in your methodology, the Anishinaabe suffer the expense of the subsidies, but get none of the revenues that did exist because they're corporate taxes and are not caught by your methodology, correct?
It's true that corporate taxes are not included revenues for us.
And you don't impute any charges for rights of way or easements that railway for the railway's use of land in the territory. Is that fair?
We're not aware of any revenue that accrued to the Crown from that. Now, I am aware, we are aware, Bodway and Smart were aware that the Crown did give rights of way to railways. So that the Crown permitted private railways to build on a right of way on Crown lands. And in such cases, we did consider whether that should lead to any change in our approach and concluded that it should not, that we would regard that as ignorable in our accounts because we would break it down into, well, the railway in such cases made a use of the land and there was some value with that use that could be imputed to the Crown. The use of Crown land could be imputed as a benefit
Yes.
received by the Crown, but there was an offsetting subsidy offered to the railways, which was the right granted to the railways to use those Crown lands in the right of way. And so even if we were to include any,
Even if you were to include any, I think you may have made a mistake, but I'll try and point that out to you shortly.
I just want to have your attention while I give my answer, just to make it easier for us to communicate. If we were to include any accounting of the private railways use of Crown land in their rights of way, it would be an offsetting imputed revenue that was not collected by the Crown and imputed expense to give the use of that land to the railway. We could have made such an imputation, but it would be offsetting in the gross revenue and gross expense amounts, and so it wouldn't change anything. So we didn't try to do that.
But you don't know how much the government would charge for the privilege of a right of way, do you?
To my knowledge, they never charged for that right.
No, they didn't. That's the point. There was no revenue associated with the transportation category, right?
Right. And I can explain why it's irrelevant. Let's imagine that the railway's use of Crown land was worth $1 million and that, we would choose to impute $1 million in expense to the Crown. At the same time, we would impute to the Crown, excuse me, I got to correct what I just said. We could impute $1 million in potential revenue to the Crown, but then we would impute $1 million in expense because the Crown chose not to collect those revenues. So it wouldn't change the bottom line. The Crown gave.
It would be an expense because they gave it away.
Yes, the Crown freely gave the use of Crown land for railway rights of way.
Mhm.
There was no net revenue associated with that.
Did you?
Can I just see if I understand that? Because there is a value, let's say $1 million to the use of this land where the railroad tracks lay. I'm just thinking of a question. The Crown land was worth $1 million, so there's a value. You say you could impute $1 million therefore as an expense, as opposed to $1 million in revenue not collected, you would impute it as an expense, as if the Crown had written a check for $1 million and given it to the railways, and then charged them $1 million to run their railway on it. Is that what imputing an expense means when you don't charge?
Yes, I think that's right. In other
So
words,
is it like a subsidy?
so I'll remind the court and everyone, the Professor Stiglitz referred to the concept of tax expenditure, which is a common term in our field. We can think of this as a kind of a tax expenditure, that the Crown chose not to collect any rent from the railways for the use of Crown lands here. So they undertook to give the use of the land freely to the railways. That's a kind of a tax expenditure, a revenue that could have been collected but was not. If we were to account for that in our accounts, it would have zero net impact on net Crown revenues.
According to your methodology, but Professors Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings would treat it quite differently. You understand that?
I'm not sure that I do. We'd have to delve into detail, and I'll remind you, Mr. Schechter, that Professor Bodway intends to testify, particularly about the difference between our approach and what Professor Stiglitz did.
Would you agree with me, sir, that the transportation revenue category is not a revenue category at all? It's merely an expense category, the way that you've treated it?
Mr. Lipton is on his feet.
Sorry, I just wanted to intervene here because my friend is mischaracterizing a little bit what table C2 is about. I just like to read the title of the table so we all understand what the table covers. The title for table C2 is Estimated Net Crown Resource-Based Revenues by Category, RST. So it is the difference between revenues and expenses. It is not purporting to show only revenues.
No, I appreciate that.
Okay.
And I think the witness pointed that out as well.
Sorry, perhaps I misunderstood my friend's question.
Thank you.
Your transportation revenue category is not a revenue category at all. It's merely just an expense category because there are no transportation revenues you take into account. you
My
agree?
answer is still the same.
Do you agree with that?
My answer is that this is not a revenue account, it's a net revenue account. As I said before, and as Mr. Lipton just repeated, that's not the same as a revenue account or a gross revenue account. Of course, net revenues can be a negative number because net revenues, and we were explicit about this from the beginning of my testimony, at the beginning of our report, net revenue means revenue minus expense.
Would you agree with me that your transport resource-based the net Crown resource-based revenues from transport could never, in your methodology, ever be positive because there are no gross expenses included? Do you agree with that?
I think you mean gross revenues. Is that?
Yes, I thank you for correcting me. There are no gross revenues. There are no gross revenues. Therefore, there could never be positive net Crown resource-based revenues from transport. Do you agree with that?
First, I'd like to say, I think some common ground for the two of us is it's hard to talk about these things from time to time because it's complicated. Net revenues are revenues minus expense. If we had found gross revenues that were referable to the Crown's subsidies to resource activities, as opposed to the taxes that the Crown was collecting on incomes of all companies, we would have included them. We found no such revenues, and so we included no such revenues.
Would you agree with me that there are no related or relevant revenues from transport that you take into account that would be supported by the transportation expenses you list?
I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to repeat the first half. No, what revenues?
Related or relevant revenue streams from transportation that you take into account that were supported by the transportation expenses you take into account?
No, I wouldn't agree with that. We include these expenses because we think they support resource development and therefore resource rents. And anything that supports resource rents does support the Crown's revenues from resource rents.
Wasn't my question. My question was about whether the transportation expenses you took into account supports any revenues you took into account. And I'm suggesting you the answer is no, because there were no revenues.
We do think they supported resource revenues. That's why we included those expenses precisely.
And they did not support any revenues from transport. You would agree with that?
Revenues were not paid to the Crown by the railways or any other transportation companies. If you're asking me that, I didn't hear that in what you said, but I
I'm going
agree
to
with
try,
that.
I'm just trying to get you to admit, and I didn't think it was controversial, but maybe it is.
Mr. Lipton?
Sorry, my friend wasn't permitting the witness to finish his answer.
Okay, go ahead. I apologize. I didn't realize I had interrupted you.
We do believe that the Crown's expenses on transportation supported resource revenues. Those resource revenues were not paid to the Crown by railway companies or other transportation companies.
You already testified to that. That's the second time. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
That's what I understood you to be asking me, whether there were. I mean, I think we agree. That's, we can read the transcript if you wish, but the question was, do these expenses support Crown revenues? I interpret that to mean precisely that, not revenues paid by transportation companies, because you didn't specify that.
All right, and that's what I was going to. I'm going to try and recap one more time. In your methodology, you found zero gross revenues from transport, correct?
Yes,
Thank you. The transport net Crown resource revenues, therefore, that are expressed in your table C2 are all expenses. They are not netted against any gross revenues from transport. That's correct.
that's correct. Everything that's in our NCR accounts is in that table.
Third proposition. The expenses in transport did not support any revenues from transport. Do you agree with that?
Yes, there are no such revenues from transport in our accounts. So I think that's what you meant by that question. They don't support any revenues from transport because in our accounts, we don't have any. We think, as I tried to explain, they support a resource development, resource rents, and resource rents in turn generate resource revenues to the Crown.
Right. So a difference in methodology, again, between you and Mr. Hutchings about whether to include in transportation expenses.
Absolutely. We
Thank you.
believe that transport,
Excuse me.
Mr. Lipton, I don't need the witness to say the same thing for a third or fourth time about what he believes.
So I'm not asking the witness to say any particular thing. I don't know what he's going to testify to. I'm just asking that he be permitted to finish his answer.
Well, in this case, when he started out, it was because we believe, I just had it 3 times. I don't need it again. If that's, we're good. I don't think I'm missing anything.
I want to be fair to the witness. Have I cut you off improperly on your answer?
I think you keep asking this question. I'm doing my best to give you the answer each time.
But is there something you want to add? I don't want to be unfair to you, Professor Smart.
I was going to say, what is the alternative? that we exclude all such expenses. That would seem to require the conclusion that what the Crown spent on railways was in no way productive of resource revenues for the Crown. And we find that to be incorrect.
I think now would be a good time for a break. I thank the reporter for their indulgence. I'm a little bit over my time.
All rise. For recess for 15 minutes. Now resume, you may be seated.
Professor Smart, could you please turn to slide 51 of 161 of your demonstratives? Slide 51 of 161 is entitled Expenses, Key Differences from Plaintiffs to 1945. And I wanted to focus in on the last bullet point, starting with in his reply report. I'll wait till you get there.
I'm there.
All right. Now, it would be fair for me to characterize what you're trying to communicate to the court is that Mr. Hutchings suggested that 80% of the expenses might be included if they are not fully excluded, and you make a reference to paragraph 91.
Yes.
Now, I'm going to suggest to you that you've misconstrued the import of his comments at paragraph 91 in the sections thereabouts, and I ask you to look at tab 12 of the compendium. Now, you quoted from paragraph 91 on page 48 of 88 of the expert reply report of David Hutchings, which is at page 39 of the compendium, but you only quoted part of it. The part that you didn't quote says, this apportionment is highly conservative as it does not take into account the protection of property, infrastructure, and public safety, nor does it consider any of the non-revenue generating benefits of productive forests. So I'm going to suggest to you that the full quote should probably include that in as well. Would you agree?
I'm not sure what quote you're referring to. I do agree that the statement you just read is in Mr. Hutchings' report.
And if you actually look at paragraph 91, what he's talking about is the apportionment between private forests and public forests. Or are reserved for parks or conservation or recreation. I apologize. So just, I'm going to try and recap that question because I don't think it was fair the way I asked it. What he says, and maybe I should read, the third line he says, per Ontario, 80% of Ontario's forests are productive, publicly owned forests, comma, while the remaining 20% are either not provincially owned or are reserved for parks, conservation, or recreation. You see, that's what he said.
Again, you're reading quotes from his report, and I agree you're reading them correctly. The slide 51 in my demonstratives that you initially asked about references the sentence you haven't read. Therefore, a conservative approach to apportionment would be to exclude 20% of fire and forest protection expenditures. I interpreted that to mean he suggested that in the alternative, 80% might be included. And I make no reference to the other sentences. I just noted that that issue was raised in that sentence of the report. Beyond that, it's Mr. Hutchings' words, and I can't say very much about them.
All right, but I'm trying to impress upon you and have you agree that you understand that the 80-20 split has to do with those parts of forests that are publicly owned and could be considered for Crown expenses, as opposed to not provincially owned or reserved for parks, conservation, or recreation, which aren't included in by either you or he, Mr. Hutchings, for inclusion as a revenue, as an expense source, excuse me. Right? You don't include in expenses for parks.
I don't know.
You don't include in expenses for conservation areas.
No,
You don't include in expenses related to recreation.
no,
You don't include in expenses for provincial, for privately owned, non-provincially owned land, do you?
I don't know what that would mean, but we don't include private expenses.
Right. So the point I'm suggesting you understood that he was making here is that 20% of the forest land is in respect of lands on which expenses don't matter, is his point.
I understood that he was discussing the possibility under a conservative approach to include 80% and exclude 20% of fire and forest protection expenditures, as stated in that sentence that I referenced, whereas his preferred approach is to include none of them. There are a variety of reasons for that, but the only sentence that I was referencing was the simple statement that a conservative approach would be to exclude 20% and therefore implicitly include 80%. That's really all I thought about when I
Right.
decided to cite that.
And you didn't think to cite the last three lines, which says this apportionment is highly conservative as it does not take into account the protection of property, infrastructure, and public safety, nor does it consider any of the non-revenue generating benefits of forest products. You didn't include that portion in.
I didn't include anything. The only thing I quoted was if they are not fully excluded. In other words, let's agree, Mr. Hutchings' preferred approach is to exclude them all. And beyond that, all I've noted is that he said a conservative approach would be to include 80% of them instead. But that's not his preferred approach.
Sorry, perhaps we can take a look at what he did say at paragraphs 89 through 90. And at 89B, which is over on the previous page, he says firefighting benefits are diffused, shared across commercial forestry, local residents and other provincial residents who benefit, for instance, from protection of recreational land and avoided air quality deterioration due to smoke. Ontario's Forest Fire Management webpage lists communities, property, timber supply, and infrastructure as its examples of values to which wildlife fires pose a risk. C, while protecting the forest industry is part of the motive in fire management, community protection also represents a critical incentive. A publication by the Ministry of Natural Resources in 2004 outlines the strategic directions for the Forest Fire Management Program, with the top one being to ensure public safety, as well as promote public education and prevention and promote fire's role in the ecosystem, period. It also explains that protecting the people of Ontario from the negative consequences of fires was the focus during the early development of Ontario's Forest Fire Management Program. So he does say those things. You agree with that he says that? And he concludes his comments about the 20/80 split, reminding the reader that that 20/80 split does not take into account these other factors that still need to be taken into account. And I'm suggesting to you that he was not trying to communicate that 80% of the expenses as an alternative should be included. Would you agree with that?
I can't really know what his intent was.
Okay. Let's turn then to section 31 to 33 of your SIR reply to Mr. Hutchings, which you'll find at tab 7. And I wanted to, at paragraph 31 to 33, this is where you deal with the geographic apportionment principle that we talked about earlier.
Okay, yes.
I'll wait for you to catch up to me. I see you're searching for the compendium. I'll wait.
I'm a bit overwhelmed, but I do have the compendium in front of me.
Okay, so tab 7, page 23 of the compendium.
Yes. Is there any one paragraph you'd like me to read or be aware of?
At paragraph 32, you propose what you say is a simple example to illustrate your point. I would ask you if you agree with me that your example that you pose at paragraph 32 does not accurately track how Mr. Hutchings deals with the geographic allocation issue, apportionment issue. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think in paragraph 32, if I recall correctly, I was responding to a critique Mr. Hutchings raised in his reply report. Recall this is a SIR reply. And you'll see that 31 starts, in his reply, Mr. Hutchings is now apparently asserting. So in other words, everything that follows is a reference to what he wrote in his reply. And it may well not be completely consistent. What he wrote may not be completely consistent with what he did in his own calculations and described in his own March 2022 report. I am agreeing with you.
Thank you. At paragraph 32, you provided what you said is a simple example, and I wanted to see if you would agree with me that the way that Mr. Hutchings dealt with it in his work papers and in his results and in his report is accurately depicted at tab 13. And rather than use percentages, because sometimes percentages can be manipulated by statisticians, and have you ever heard of the phrase statisticulate?
I don't believe I have.
Okay. Well, that's the use of statistics and percentages to make things appear different or more onerous than they might otherwise be. There's an author, I forget his name, but that in the 50s or 60s wrote about how to lie with statistics, I think is the book. In any event, the first example that I've given here is how Mr. Hutchings would allocate an example where there's one program that deals with expenses and assumes, as you did in your example at paragraph 32, that 25% of the expense was incurred in RST. One program, 25% incurred in RST, 75% or 75 units outside of RST. So 100 units of expense.
May I ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
What are we looking at now? I think it may be in the compendium, but I'm not sure what page. You haven't referred me to it. And I do not know who produced what I'm looking at on my screen.
Okay, I produced it.
Ah.
It is just a graphical demonstration of, I'm trying to see if you understand how I understand Mr. Hutchings' work papers work.
I'll do my best to comment on that. I'll be limited by my ability to understand you and also my knowledge and recollection of what Mr. Hutchings did in this regard. Recall that paragraph 32 you originally referred me to was a response to something he wrote in his reply report.
Sorry, let's try and get to your complaint, your concern, your opinion. You're trying to communicate to the court that Mr. Hutchings effectively only takes 25% of 50% because of the way he does his math. Is that fair?
No, I would suggest that we all look at paragraph 31, so we understand the context of what I raised. And, my only concern here is that my ability to accurately represent what Mr. Hutchings did and what was in his mind is limited by the fact that I've only read his statements and chosen to interpret them. And I do not wish to misrepresent what Mr. Hutchings did. In my reply report at this point, I was responding to a critique that he raised, I believe mistakenly, a critique he raised in our own calculations. So the issue isn't the issue that I was addressing here, Bodway and Smart were addressing. It's not about Mr. Hutchings' approach. It's about the concern he raised about our approach. You understand the distinction?
No, actually, I don't, because I want to try and understand why you think he's made an error. And I want to focus on your opinion. Your opinion at paragraph 32 says, let's consider a simple example. Suppose that 25% of tree planting expenses were incurred in the treaty territories and the rest in the remainder of the province. I'm going to stop there. Now, that scenario you will find at page 40 of the compendium, example 1. Take a look at that.
So this again, you're now referring me to something that you wrote that you want me to comment on.
We're comparing page 23 of the wording of 23 on the compendium to page 40 of the compendium, where the verbiage is put in graphic form.
You're asking me about paragraph 32 of my SIR reply, which
Yes.
was a response to a critique Mr. Hutchings raised. And then you're asking me to relate it to something that you produced, and which I've
Yeah.
never seen before today, which is not, according to you, related to the original critique. And indeed, we have not seen Mr. Hutchings' original critique. It's going to be difficult for me to do that.
All right, let's try and
Well,
deal with,
why don't you just try? It's going to be difficult. Let's see how far you go.
Yes, Your Honor.
all right, let's try paragraph 32. You say, suppose that 25% of tree planting expenses were incurred in the treaty territories and the rest in the remainder of the province. I'm going to stop there. Let's suppose that, and I'm going to suggest to you that Mr. Hutchings' methodology would have him take into account 25% of the tree planting expenses in the province. Would you agree with that? That's how he did his work.
I don't know the answer. Paragraph 32 is not about his methodology. I offer no opinion on that. Now, at the end of this section, I wrote, having explained why the critique that he raised was not correct, was not germane, did not lead me to conclude we'd done anything wrong. I explained why not. And then I said, if he has applied this method in his own calculations, then he has underestimated treaty spending, potentially by large amounts. So I did not at any time assert that he did anything wrong. I said his critique of our methods is not well-founded. If that offering that critique suggests that he has proceeded in the way he said that we should have proceeded, then he made a mistake in the other direction, of course. But I have not said that he did, because I did not examine his work papers with a view to determining whether he did or not. I just said, look, this critique is not valid. Here's why. And if Mr. Hutchings has done what he has told us we should have done, he made an error. But I didn't say he did, because I don't know.
I'm sorry, I got the impression that you were suggesting he'd made a mistake,
Well,
but you don't make that suggestion.
in paragraph 32, I say, if he has applied this method in his calculations, then he has made a mistake.
You have no reason to believe he's made that mistake, do you?
I'm not asserting he made that mistake because I did not review his work papers for the purposes of determining whether he made it or not. I was merely responding to a critique that he raised of our methods.
Thank you, sir. Perhaps then we can turn to forestry expenses and Exhibit 68. I'd like to start with that. Now, Exhibit 68 is the report of the Timber Revenue Task Force, which was brought into evidence, I guess, last week and marked as an exhibit on Tuesday. Do you have that in front of you?
Yes,
Chelsea, do I have it? Did you bring it down?
And-
68? I know you alerted us. Oh, no, we got it. Thanks. Okay, go ahead.
Right, now, the first thing I want to start about forest expenses and forest protection expenses is I want to observe that before the arrival of humans on the planet, there were forests, of course. You agree with that?
yes,
And there were forest fires before humans arrived, and I think most of them occurred probably by lightning, maybe some by lava.
to the
It's
best
late
of
in the
my
day.
knowledge.
Right? And there might be a few dinosaurs that would also attribute fires to comets. I said there might be a few dinosaurs that attribute some fires to comets.
Comments. I understand. Yes, sure.
Yes, but most of them are probably lightning.
It goes beyond my expertise. Obviously, I'm not,
Right.
I'm not an expert on,
However they may have, whether whether by lightning, by
sure. There are natural causes to fires. I
natural
fully agree.
causes of some sort. The forests were here when people arrived,
Yes,
and the forests survived notwithstanding that there were fires from time to time. The point is that over time, forests regenerate without fire protection by humans. Would you agree with that?
it's really beyond my expertise. In the fullness of the history of the planet Earth, I think that's true. Trees burn, other things grow there, and they may indeed be trees eventually. Sure.
Now, would you agree with me that when Europeans began populating North America, they brought with them hazards for the forest?
Yes,
So some fires were caused by settlers clearing land where the fire got out of control.
yes, I've seen specific reference to that issue.
Many fires were started along railroad lines?
Yes. Yes, recall that
Some forest fires are started by campers due to their carelessness or negligence? You would agree with that?
yes, I think I would.
And would you agree that the most heavily fought forest fires are those fought to preserve lives and infrastructure and to keep forest fires from reaching towns, villages, and peoples and infrastructure?
I can't go quite so far. It calls for kind of characterization of of quantities here. You said the most heavily fought. I just don't know the data well enough to say whether that's true.
How about most of the expense? The Crown expends more money fighting forest fires that threaten lives and infrastructure than it does to protect timber births in areas that are not populated.
I've never seen any data to support what you just said, Mr. Schechter. And I provided an example of the kind of data we see in the annual reports of the area in question that suggests that the fires that Crown was concerned about were fires on timberlands, either those that had yet to be harvested or those that had recently been harvested.
Are you referring to Exhibit 68?
No, I'm not.
Let's take a look at Exhibit 68, and perhaps you can remind me, how did you find this document?
I found it on a library shelf as I was looking for documents related to the basic organization function of the Department of Lands and Forests, which Mr. Hutchings raised. It's an important issue in his testimony for the first time. So I went to the library and it was literally on the shelf of the library next to the particular report that I'd been seeking out at that moment.
I want to go through some of this report with you. And I want to start at page Roman numeral 1, the executive summary. And when I read the executive summary, the very first page, I see in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th line down of the first paragraph, there is a task force under the joint direction of the treasurer and the Ministry of Natural Resources. The treasurer's 1974 budget statement indicated specifically that it is our intention to implement a system which will be more responsive to changes in forest company profits, revenue rising with increasing profits and declining with decreasing profits. Now, the revenue he's referring to, or the authors are referring to, whoever they are, is the revenue of the province. Is that correct?
Yes.
It goes on to say the Timber Revenue Task Force was formed with 3 members of the Ministry of Natural Resources, 1 from the Ministry of Revenue, and 3 from the Ministry of Treasury, Economics, and Intergovernmental Affairs. See that?
Yes.
It says the task force met on a regular basis and conducted its investigation over a period of 8 months, so an 8-month study. Now, in your experience, is that a good study, a long time to study, or is there's no pejorative or adjective that you would describe?
I don't feel strongly about it one way or the other.
Okay. Did you look to see if there was any reference to consultation with Aboriginal people about this report?
I don't recall seeing that statement or whether I was looking for it. As far as I know, that statement isn't in the report.
No, I didn't find any reference to any consultation with the Robinson Superior Anishinaabe at all, or any Aboriginal person. So you can confirm that?
This was a task force on timber revenue in 1974. As far as I know, they didn't consult with the RST Anishinaabe.
And if we go to Roman numeral 3, the task force at item number 2 talks about the pricing policy. And the pricing policy they're talking about is the price for the use of natural resources. Is that fair?
I think so. I'd prefer to read more context around this, but
Sure, go ahead.
that's what this
Take
was
your time.
about. So it's about the Crown dues policy, more broadly, the Crown revenue policy, and whether there should be increases in Crown revenues or not.
So one of the things that's identified at Roman numeral 3 is item number 2. And I'm just gonna read the first part of the paragraph. This
Sorry,
price,
where did we go?
we're at Roman numeral 3,
Of, No.
exhibit 68,
right? Did you give me a page
uh,
reference?
page I.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Oh, I see. When I said Roman numeral 3, I appreciate what I did
Mm.
wrong. I
No, no,
apologize.
I get it.
Okay, so page I. Item number 2, this pricing policy, which we've understood is the pricing policy for the use of resources, was deficient in the following ways. 1, it was not sufficiently responsive to the industry's cyclical pattern. Are you with me?
Yes,
2, it did not adequately compensate the province for the use of this resource. So one of the concerns that they had was they weren't charging enough for resources.
yes.
And at the bottom of this page, or about 5 or 6 lines down in paragraph, in determining an appropriate level of charge, 3 factors were considered. And the first factor is the industry's ability to pay. Second, the level of charges in other jurisdictions. And 3, the costs incurred by the Ministry of Natural Resources in regenerating and managing the forests in the province. Ideally, the province should structure the level of charges to recover its cost plus a return. However, the former 2 factors place a constraint in achieving that objective. You read that? You see that?
Yes,
And have you read this report?
not in its entirety.
No?
No.
Okay. So just to get to the finish line on this, on their recommendation, they actually talk about trying to recover $40 million from the revenue stream. And this is over on Roman numeral 4, page IV. Even though the expenses are going to be greater than 40 million. So they're making a recommendation to operate at a loss. Do you realize that that's what this document purports?
We could debate precisely how to measure that loss, given that expenses may be referable to revenues collected in a different year. But of course, the conclusion that the Crown forestry policies resulted in a loss should not be a surprise to this court. It's been the key message of all of my testimony around the post-1945 policies. Revenues that the Crown got from forestry, stumpage, and related charges were lower than what it had spent. And no question that that's true. And I tried to explain the policy choices the Crown made that resulted in that were not part of our assignment. We were just asked to measure what those net Crown revenues were. And we agree, as this report indicates, as you've just quoted from it, that net Crown revenues were negative.
Let's take a look at Roman numeral 4 in the middle of the page, or page IV. In the middle of the page, the industry is an important element. It reads, the industry, and that's referring to the forest industry, is an important element of Ontario's economy, especially when viewed in a regional context. Forest-based industries account for approximately 63% of the total employment in goods producing industries in the northwestern region and 20% in the northeastern region of the province. Now, RST is the northwestern region of the province, correct?
Not exactly, no,
No.
but RST is in what we think of as the Northwest.
All right, thank you. And it identifies the next bullet, much of the industry is labor intensive. However, rapidly escalating labor costs are leading to greater mechanization. And that relates to how an industry can respond to rising labor costs by mechanizing and increasing productivity, right?
Yes, something I spoke about is, as you may recall.
Right. And at the bottom of this page is the reference to the target level of revenue for 76, 77 should be 40 million. And I want to jump to page 42 of this report, because remember when we talk about the benefits that forests bring are not just, when we talk, I apologize. When Mr. Hutchings talks about, and Professor Stiglitz talk about other benefits from forestry, we have a good indication from the task force what they believe those other benefits were. So under the heading tax burden, we see the following words. The following table contains an estimate of the amount of direct revenue Ontario collected from the forest-based industry during 1974. And it's table XII. And the Crown charges refers to things like direct stumpage, right? $29 million.
Yes,
They're also, however, including in as a forest-related expense, corporate income and capital taxes of 14 million, retail sales taxes of 4 million, and gasoline taxes of 3 million, which they attribute to the forest industry.
I think you said expense when you meant revenue.
Yes, thank you.
In this table, they do identify, they measure, I imagine from the public accounts, the corporate income taxes, and then we had a capital tax in Ontario as well that was payable by corporations. And they included in their list of Ontario revenue from the forest-based industry. And I would agree with that characterization, but I don't think that's the same as saying it's a tax on resource rents.
You would agree that it's a benefit from the existence of forests in Ontario?
No, I tried to explain that before. Economists think of the tax, the corporate tax as being mainly ultimately incident on the return to capital and not the return to any other input of production, not labor and not the natural resources. One way of thinking about that is in a but-for world in which we did not have the resources. Well, we would still likely, in the standard model in an economist's mind, would likely have about the same amount of capital. And the capital would represent the savings of Canadians that are put to use by industry and the imported capital from non-Canadians as well. And if they were not employed in the resource sector, by and large, we think they would be employed in other sectors of the economy. So that the income that's derived there, although it may be paid in a legal sense by companies active in the forest sector, the amounts they're paying don't come out of their resource rents. And in the absence of the resources themselves, we would likely see those workers employed in other sectors of the economy, such as goods manufacturing. We would likely see the capital itself going with those workers to those other sectors that would then be expanded in the Ontario economy. And so there's no sense in which economists would attribute those corporate income tax revenues in the first instance to the resource rents. Does that make sense?
Well, I understand what you're communicating. But I want to, instead of going to the but for world, I want to go stay with the real world, which is this report from 1975. And what the authors of this report are communicating to the reader is that the value to Ontario of the forest industry is not simply the Crown charges, but also includes in these other benefits in the way of corporate income tax, capital tax, retail sales tax, and gasoline tax. Wouldn't you agree that that's what they're communicating?
They don't use the word benefit to the Crown or any of the words that I heard you say. This is a subsection obviously called tax burden. So the question is, what taxes are paid by companies in the forest sector? That's what they're answering.
I think it says, I'm going to read it. The following table provides an estimate of the amount of direct revenue Ontario collected from the forest-based industry during 1974.
That's right. That's what
And
it
I'm
is.
going to
Factually, it's
suggest-
exactly what it is.
And you disagree with me that they're trying to communicate in this report that the benefits from the forest industry of direct revenue is $50 million in 1974? Are you disagreeing with that?
Well, the word benefit.
Yeah.
Is your interpolation. It's revenue, exactly as it says here.
Okay. Now, if you flip the page to page 43 of the report, it says, in addition to this revenue, and that's the direct revenue, it should be noted that the employees of the forest industry also contribute to provincial revenue through personal income and other forms of taxes and levies. You see that?
Yes.
So they're indicating that in addition to direct revenue streams related to forest industry, there is also indirect revenues. You agree with that?
It does say that.
They also say that various other governments also collect property taxes and a variety of wages and salaries, such as workmen's compensation and Canada pension. But they don't seem to indicate what it is. Do you know what other governments they're talking about?
Property taxes are generally levied in Canada by municipal governments. Workers' compensation, I believe at that time, was an agency, an entity of the government of Ontario that was outside the CRF. So it wasn't part of the government of Ontario, but it was an Ontario entity. Canada Pension Plan, of course, is a joint entity it's an entity of the government of Canada, which exists outside the CRF of the government of Canada.
So these kinds of indirect, direct corporate over and above stumpage and indirect benefits, you understand that in Stiglitz and Hutchings' view, this is part of the rents that the Crown collects. You understand that that's their view, right?
There is no doubt that forestry companies pay corporate income taxes to the Crown in Canada. We've made that clear. I'm sure you're right that Hutchings and Stiglitz make it clear in various ways as well. I have tried to explain why it is not commonly considered by economists to be revenue derived from resource rents. Professor Bodway, I believe, intends to testify at some length on the issue of the difference between our approach, Professor Stiglitz's approach to rents, the questions of why effective Crown tax rates on rents are what they are. So if you're asking, do we acknowledge that there are corporate income taxes that are paid in a legal sense the legal incidence of them is on forestry companies. That is true.
Now, if you go over to page 93, the authors of this report identify that in order, they're trying to determine at page 93 and following what portion of the expenses that are incurred by the forestry department that are recognized in, that are identified in the Ontario public accounts should be attributed to the forest industry. Do you see that at the bottom of page 93?
I'm reading as much of page 93 as I can. If there's a particular phrase that you want me to comment on, please let me know.
Yes. At the bottom three lines, in recognition that all assigned costs are not incurred for the sole benefit of the forest industry, only that portion of the cost that can be attributed to the industry should be isolated for consideration. And they refer to a table XVIII.
Yes,
You've seen that?
absolutely. And my own demonstratives include that table XVIII, I believe.
I don't believe it does.
Let's see.
Did you show me, and you've omitted that table, but you have the two tables prior to it. And those tables can be found at pages 55, 56, and 57. So would you first agree with me that your demonstratives included in slides at page, sorry, included as slides, page 55 and 56?
Yes,
But you didn't include in 57.
Sorry, it didn't include.
You did not include in the table at page 57.
yes,
You agree with me?
that's true.
I'm missing it.
Yeah.
So we're on page 93. And there's a reference to tables.
There's a reference to one table. It's to the table at page 57
At page 57 of.
of exhibit 68.
Okay, got it.
All right. So this is the attempt of the authors of this publication to ask themselves the question that I think is a fair question. How much of what we spend is actually attributable to the forest industry as opposed to other benefits that people in Ontario might enjoy? And if you'll look under assumed industry share, under forest resource production, they have 100%. Under forest access roads, they only attribute 25% to the industry or the forestry industry. See that?
Yes,
In your calculations, you attribute 100% to the forest industry.
and so does Mr. Hutchings.
In the miscellaneous indirect management, they attribute 25% to forestry. You attribute 100% of that category of spending.
I'm not sure that that's right. Miscellaneous indirect management is a term introduced in this report to reference certain items in the PAO. It's not clear to me which ones are there. As you know, we have our own approach to overhead expenses, which apportions them.
The fire forest protection attribution is 25%. You attribute 100%. Is that correct?
That is true.
Mr. Lipton is on his feet.
Sorry, I would just remark that my friend referred to the last, I believe, non-total row. This table is forest fire protection. The name of the item is in fact forest protection.
Thank you. Would you agree with me that forest protection includes in the fire management?
I would have to review the document to know what's included there.
Well, you can take a look at the tables you did refer to at paragraph at pages 55 and 56. I want to sort of compare these results to your comments at slide 68, I believe it is.
Of the demonstratives?
Of the demonstratives. So you note that, and let's just use 1966, 67, you observe that $29.4 million is what your approach arrived at. And you make the point, aha, the task force report arrives at 25.2 million. But that 25.2 million is a calculation not based on what these authors believed should be attributed to forests, but generally. The amount that should be attributed to forests, or the forest industry, excuse me, in 1966, 67, is not 25.2 million, but is 16.16 million. And I'm reading from table, the page 57, table XVIII. So that's at page 57 of Exhibit 68, under the column 1966, 1967, total of costs assigned to forest industry. It's not 25.2 million, it's 16.16 million.
Well, that's what's in table 18.
Yes. So they've come up with a different amount attributable to the forest industry than you did.
Table 18 does have a different amount based on different apportionment than is in the prior two tables. Recall that the reason I wanted the court to see this evidence was to respond to the question of whether the PAO could be used to engage in this exercise of measuring Crown support to forestry. And I've included these tables in order to show that others knowledgeable about the public accounts in the industry thought that it was possible to do it, and that when they did it, they relied on the same information the PAO as I did. Now, in table 18, they go further than they do in 16 and 17, and they propose one particular way of measuring the Crown support from the data that I used and that they used. They note on page 53 of the report that you asked me to look at, that this is a conservative approach. Bottom of the first partial paragraph, it says those expenditures on the forest resource, which are of benefit to multiple users of the resource, are conservatively assigned to the forestry industry at a level of 25%. The next paragraph goes on to say, in effect,
I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you please tell me where you're reading from
page 53, Your Honor, of the
of the report?
Exhibit 68 report.
Got it. Thank you. Go ahead.
They go on in the paragraph beginning with the word clearly to say that making those apportionments involves value judgments, and that the assignments in table 18 cannot be defended to the percentage point. And then they note that the numbers they put into table 18 were based on consultations with ministry personnel, and I think this is important, representatives of the Ontario forest industry. In other words, table 18, I think, represents certain compromise values here. And the authors of the report are not suggesting that table 18 is the only conclusion that could be drawn about Crown expenses in support of forestry, but one possible set of such values. Furthermore, if we were to include only the percentage they did and arrive at the figure of 16.2 million, then we would include more than, in that alternative, one would be including more than 50% of the amounts that both Wei and I included. I've already talked to what would happen if we reduced our forestry expense, that it would mainly affect the value of NCRs and not mainly affect annuities.
One more question, and then I think we're ready for,
Is it possible that I missed something there? I thought the question that Mr. Schachter asked was, go to slide 68.
Yes,
Where you reported, or you reproduced, I'm not sure, or you created a chart that showed that 1966-67, the expenses included as per the 1975 task force report were 25.2%.
25.2 million.
Sorry, 25.2 million. I'm looking at the column entitled 1966-67 on your slide 68.
yes, Your Honor.
Okay, I thought Mr. Schachter brought that number to your attention. And then I thought he brought to your attention from page 57 of the report. Column also headed 1966-67. And in the second last row, called total of costs assigned to forest industry, 16.163.
That
Did I
table
miss that?
does,
Did I miss that, Mr. Schachter?
No, that's it.
And I thought he asked you about that difference. And then did you possibly took me to page 53? But were you, I just don't, I missed possibly. What is the explanation for that difference?
the explanation for the difference
Between
between our values.
25.2 and 16.16.
Well, as I was discussing, based on the text on page 53,
Yes,
table 18 reflects an apportionment of forestry expense. You refer back to page 52, you'll see that the task force report says tables 16 and 17, the ones in my report, present government expenditures for forest management and forest protection.
yes.
On my slide 68, I conflate those together into forest management. Right? As I said before, that's the catch-all term.
So if
So
you
I
just tell me then,
presented-
where does this number come from? In your chart, 25.2?
It comes from table 17 and 16.
If I can be of assistance to the court.
It's the sum.
It's the sum of the columns plus adding back in federal contributions and reimbursements, correct?
I believe so. I was confused by that. I was going to say it's the sum of the amounts in tables 16 and 17, the tables that are appended. to
It's
my
actually
report.
not. It's actually higher than the net result in those tables because of the federal contributions that got added back in. So we were going to get to that in probably
Okay.
tomorrow morning.
So it's anyway, where you got to that number is a calculation. It doesn't show here. It's a calculation, or it's a addition of sums from other sources. Other sources than table 18, or sorry, 15. 5, 3, 18.
I've done the math to reconcile this and I can explain it. Perhaps tomorrow might be a little bit better.
All right,
And it's just an amalgam of a number of numbers from tables 50, the tables on 55 and 56. It's not a simple addition of the bottom lines of the two tables.
you're suggesting that I should take a break.
Well, I'm not suggesting, I
I'm
just
okay with
told, I told people that I would go till 4:30 and I'm way over.
Okay. Good suggestion. Okay, let's break for the day. 10 o'clock, and council, we're meeting in the over the lunch hour with respect to a schedule for submissions. Okay,
Okay.
that we'll figure out the time then. Thank you. You take that back.
The settings of this court is not included on the.